So it's 18 months since the start of the pandemic, and I think it's worth asking, how has it changed us? Here to discuss this and other topics is Ben Cobley, who is Research Fellow at Civitas and author. Welcome, Ben.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
Great. So it all started off so well, in a sense, the bird song and the communitarianism, and the first lockdown was quite an odd experience, wasn't it, in a way? But it was positive in a way because everyone was in it together. But that sort of solidarity didn't really last, did it?
I think it's there's a mixture of it really, because I think in some ways it has, but obviously I think the reason, or the main reason why it's probably changed, or at least in public, has been the politicisation of it. And the way that different political groups have got hold of it and really looked to push their thing, and they form their different tribes. And, you know, for example, Carol Cadwallader is heading the Independent Sage, which is attacking the government, so has brought that anti-Brexit sort of element in. And it's like the old Brexit tribes have reformed.
Couldn't resist it,
and have been hammer and tongs, ever since. So I think there's that aspect. The political aspect definitely has gone very, very sour. But I think there's different levels to it, and I think at the local community level, it has been a bit different. It has, I think it has diluted from, like you say, the initial. It was beautiful summer, wasn't it? We had in the first lockdown. Anyway,
yeah,
sorry.
it was strange because there was almost, there was total agreement in the political class to what was doing, what was being done, and so everyone got behind it, and everyone was behind it because there was no alternative really. I mean, we were fully supportive of the first lockdown, and society seemed to. It was a rare event really for everyone to be on the same page really, but it seems quite distant really.
Yeah, I think again that was looking at it in a political way, and I mean what I remember from the first lockdown was. I mean, obviously it wasn't all positive.
No.
But there was a kind of a sort of a kind of a paradise aspect to it, of the great weather, and actually people being in their local communities.
But the spirit, the sort of national spirit was there, and I guess it was the first time
I'm
many of us.
thinking more local with, around my area, for example, you would see a lot more of people, actually neighbours, talking to each other over the front garden fence, and walking around their local area with their children, children spending time with their parents more during the day. I mean, obviously, like I say, it wasn't all positive, but there was so much that I thought was beautiful in
Birdsong.
Birdsong, we didn't have, in South London, where I live, you didn't have the aeroplanes going overhead, so you didn't have so much traffic, so it was quieter. So in
Prelapsarian.
In some ways it was quite beautiful, and for people, working people, obviously, lots of negatives to not going into work and not doing so much work, but people weren't commuting, weren't spending up to like 3 hours a day driving in traffic jams or on trains and being knackered when they got home. So those are the positive local sort of community aspects to it, and I thought it was in some ways a really good example of what a communitarian society kind of looks like
and sound like.
Yeah.
I mean the car thing's really interesting because I think if we could all be like Sark, it's highly utopian, but if we could all be like Sark. Sark's a Channel island that has no cars.
Of course.
Yeah, so you have this sort of, pre-industrial paradise really, and you get the only other time you get a snapshot of it where I live in Northumberland is when really heavy snowfall, which removes all of the cars, and also the snowfall dampens the sound. So it's like, what's that sound? It's peace.
Yes.
It's so unusual. And in a way, I think, it was good for people to get a little taster of what it might be like if we're not hurtling around on, as you say, on 3-hour commutes and all the rest of it.
It's like, just briefly, in the southeast of England, you can barely be in a place where you can't hear a main road.
Yeah, it's impossible.
And I personally find that a really sad thing.
It's very sad. And have you ever seen, Ben, the silent maps or the quiet map of Britain? There is such a thing. And it's sort of got, noise, general background noise levels. And obviously it's the urban area. But a lot of the southeast is noisy. I mean, even my village in Northumberland, 4,000 of us, and you've got a major road next to us. There's a constant hum. You get it. But when it's taken away, you get a chance to say, okay, what could life be like, I guess. But it's fascinating that you've identified these levels, because I agree. I mean, I'm a politician. I would look at it. I would look at the political position. We had to, and we couldn't not comment on it.
So you think we had to lock down, and do you think out of political reasons, or is it out of scientific reasons, or
Well, there isn't.
Not
I
sure.
mean, there's so much in this, Ben. So there isn't the science. Science is contested, as we know, and science, particularly when you're dealing with open systems and highly dynamic situations, the models are models. They're not reality. But what was surely true was that no government anywhere is going to ignore the two expert committees. So the government weren't going to ignore SAGE and NervTag. So I mean, I discussed this with Peter Hitchens. He said, well, we shouldn't be locking down. I said, well, and Sweden's not locking down to the same extent, but they missed the point. The real key point was that Sweden's government action was aligned to his experts. Yeah. So the Swede Tignaland is the other guy's name. They said don't lock down, and the government said, okay, if that's your advice, we'll do it.
So that made it politically acceptable.
Yeah. And they
yes,
and
on this, and I think that's very understandable, because politicians, we're not scientists, and even the science is contested, I think, like you just said.
Yeah.
So we can't really pronounce on this issue, I think, as experts. And if your appointed experts are telling you to do one thing,
you pretty much got to do it.
Very difficult to go against it.
Yeah. So our Prime Minister, theoretically, probably a libertarian by instinct. That he locked down. He locked down several times, and he did so because he was told to by his experts. But we at the start. So we as a party, we supported the first lockdown. Everyone did. It's unknown. It's a new virus. And also it was promised for a particular purpose. It was to build NHS capacity, and then it was only going to be a few weeks, and it extended. So we fully supported that. But as it went on, I felt I had to speak out on one particular point, which was that they weren't, and I understand why they weren't doing this, but they weren't being straight, I guess, with the public on the trade-offs. So they were pretending, and they had to do this for messaging purposes. I understand why they had to do it, but they were pretending that there were no real. They were downplaying the costs of the suppression measures on health, mental health. Large quantity of debt going forward. Debt is.
And briefly, from what I hear, I was speaking to someone who manages GP practices yesterday. Was saying this is all the bill is starting to come in now.
Yeah.
She said one thing with mental health.
Yeah.
Is a real issue here. Yeah.
It is, and so I didn't. I mean, it was. We were talking about utopia before. Maybe we're talking about it again. Maybe I was being utopian and wanting a political response that was balanced and acknowledged the trade-offs. Maybe the politics can't do that, because imagine Johnson at a SAGE meeting, it's not a SAGE meeting, but a press meeting, at 5 o'clock press meeting, saying, well, actually it's quite on balance this, but on balance we think we should lock down. But it must, I mean, again, one of the things we got through as a party straight away was there should be another committee to establish to at least look and try and quantify the costs.
So you mean in the SDP you set up like a subcommittee on COVID, did you? To discuss it.
It was a policy team looked at it in detail, but it wasn't. But we suggest part of our policy was that the government should have a separate committee. So you have, if you ask an epidemiologist or a virologist, so what's your response to this? They're not trained in economic costs. They're not. That's not part of their remit to know that. And so they advised within the terms as if there was no cost. But what you needed, it's the one time, Ben, where I said you need an economist in the room. You need someone to say.
It's interesting that, yes. And I mean, my mum's actually a virologist, a retired virologist, and talking to her about it, I mean, she understands viruses quite well, and in that terms, she knows she doesn't understand this one, and is afraid of it, and wants strict controls. But at the same time, she knows that she's not an expert in all the rest of it, and in the unintended, unforeseen consequences. And I mean, to be fair, I think, I mean, to model that, to try and you can't really.
It can't. No, it's like you have to go back.
So I do have a lot of sympathy for anyone who's been in a position of power, including yourself, just in a political party, having to confront it politically. But in government and in these scientific circles as well, it's like they've actually got to act and do something.
Yeah.
And so I have a large measure of sympathy in dealing with that. Although I think, like a lot of people, that has waned in the last few months with all the flip-flopping.
Yeah, they haven't. I mean, they this is really another really interesting thing internationally, how... So Patrick F. Flynn said on Twitter the other day that we may, in terms of large countries that have been through this, we might be the first country to actually get through it, pretty much. A lot of people have got antibodies. Death rates are pretty low, might remain low. So we may be getting to a situation where it's not over, because as long as it's in the world, it's not over. But as a pandemic, it may be over. Do you think that's possible?
I don't know.
No one knows.
I don't know.
So we don't.
I mean, people have been making predictions all the way through this, and most of them have been wrong.
Yeah.
I think, and a lot of them very, very wrong, including by senior scientists. I mean, I can't remember examples. I haven't been following this closely, but and I think that's in a way this has brought out a lot of the bad ways of how people approach public policy. In our public life, you've got to look as if you know what you're talking about.
And they can't
As if you understand.
We don't know. We don't know.
It's like that thing with keeping face.
Yeah.
In places like India and the Far East, you can't. It's very difficult to say in those cultures that I actually just don't know. And we have the same thing here. This is how our political power works, is by appearing to know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And having the political backup behind you to do that, and a lot of it is complete nonsense.
Yeah, no, they can't. It's to get back to the point we were making earlier about the fact that they can't say it's an unbalanced thing. They've got to wholeheartedly say this is what we must do, even though it's a matter of authority, and they assume, I think, through a lot of their focus groups, that this is what appeals to people. And I think in this situation with COVID, that has completely fallen apart. Yeah.
I mean, it falls apart regularly on individual things in politics and life, but this has been going on now for a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they as I say, when you it's 18 months now, and we started in solidarity. But then, as you said, let's examine this. People started to sort of reconvene value divides. And I agree with you totally, Ben. I think at local levels, I don't think that happened, because actually, free of agitation, I think at local levels people can rub along. Most people would say actually where they were, their friends, their neighbours all worked together pretty much. But nationally and in the political sphere, all of these little divisions were reconvened, didn't they? People, the tribes, as you would say, got together and started fighting.
They gathered around certain things and themes, and this is what happens in politics. It takes a while for them to find their themes. Of course, they do their focus groups and their polling, and they find out what they think is most effective.
What are we doing? What's our group going to say?
Yeah, and then they hammer it for all it's worth, and a lot of it is just desperately tiresome and not worth paying attention to. But of course, I mean, I'm thinking primarily of, like I said earlier, the Cadwallader, the anti-Brexit, sort of anti-Tory, anti-Boris Johnson sort of group. They all gathered and made their big thing. Harsh
lockdowns.
They were, exactly. And that mobilised their opposition. And this is the way politics works. One group, it's like physics, isn't it? every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So they mobilise their opposition, and especially the libertarian, also the neoliberal sort of groupings on the right, which were generally pro-Brexit as well. So you have those same two tribes hammering away on a different issue, but they were connecting it. Well, they have been connecting it all the time.
Yeah, but it's really interesting
because it's the same type of thing.
Because it's political clustering, isn't it? And I've always, because our type of politics is a mix. So I've always been quite critical of all this clustering. Why, if you took a view on sort of how Britain should be governed, into the EU or not, it shouldn't inform what your view of masks are. But it seems to. Well,
I think if you're thinking like that we should be rational, which is a sort of conventional philosophical view and even political view. But I think most of us, most of the time, it's just not realistic. We don't know, and we tend to grab hold of those people that are close to us
for guidance,
and those that we trust.
Yeah.
And I think going back to the political tribe. So if you're a vehement anti-Brexit protester, and all those, the major anti-Brexit campaigners are completely, sort of, you must wear masks all the time everywhere. You tend to just fall in with that.
But they were really
and since your grouping, your social groupings would tend to be gathered around, those issues, then your friends will think kind of like that, and you all have the same type of opinion.
But there was some really serious consequences to that, though, particularly in journalism. And we've got all this culture war from the States, last summer, and I think it's obviously interlinked. It's a separate issue, but it's interlinked. But in the States, the topics that WAPO and the New York Times and CNN were quite happy to look at. They looked at, but the ones that they thought were off limits, they really carefully. I mean, the lab leak thing for a start, because Trump mentioned that there's a lab in Wuhan, it might have leaked from there. No, you can't think that because he thinks that. So it was sort of taken off. So the rationality was destroyed.
So you have that typical, and I think it's quite typical of progressives actually, more than others. I was going to say conservatives, but it's not just conservatives, but just others. Is of concealment.
Yeah.
And going back to authority as well. If you're a progressive, you know the progress of history.
Yes.
You know the future.
And everyone else is stupid.
So you have complete authority over what happens. This is basically what it comes down to with progressives, and so they can't really let go, and it keeps on clashing with reality for them, and with like that if reality goes a different way, you just sort of conceal it, you just push it aside.
But that's what they did.
And we see. My specialist thing is mostly identity politics, and we've seen it on all sorts of identity politics issues. If it's not convenient, if it doesn't fix into that progressive framework, they will just not talk about it, and they will ignore it. I mean, the child sex or exploitation around different towns like Rotherham and Rochdale, that's a classic example. You just, on the left, you just can't talk about it.
But they did in the pandemic, and how it was reported globally, and who said what, and how different countries were doing. This was still the lens that they looked through it. So if Hungary did quite well early on, it can't be the case that, because Orban's there, so they've got to get everything wrong. Yes. And Ardern was praised in New Zealand partly because she was a progressive woman, and actually what started pretty good has ended pretty poorly. But they couldn't resist. They couldn't look at it anywhere near clinically or analytically.
So it means they just cannot be honest, because they're too busy protecting their, if you like, in philosophical terms, a priori assertions and knowledge and their authority. And I mean, on an extreme level, you've had that with regimes like the Chinese Communist Party, of course. I'm thinking North Vietnam as well. I mean, one of the reasons in the Vietnam War is that we all look and we blame the Americans primarily, and also the South Vietnamese, is because that was all visible. What they were doing, it was filmed. There were journalists everywhere. North Vietnam, it was all concealed, except for a few tiny little things. All sorts of atrocities were happening on their side too, but it was concealed. We don't know about it. So it was a very successful concealment procedure, continuous. And I think we have that obviously on a different sort of level and scale, but consistently with progressives here, they do that. And I'm not saying conservatives and others don't do that too, but I think progressives have a lot more to protect. They've got their assertions and authority.
But they're good. They're very good at saying, condemning individuals as bad. I mean, that's one of the central tactics. So Trump bad, so therefore everything Trump says bad or wrong. Yeah. And I mean, just like a stop clock, he may be right occasionally, and maybe on some of these things he had something to say, but it couldn't be. They couldn't give him any credit, even if he was right, just because of who he was. I mean, we've started to look at it in terms of what we call the good list and the bad list, and there are a whole series of regimes, and individuals that are on the good list, and the people on the good list, like Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, gets away with a really shockingly bad pandemic. Wasn't really held to account. He's being held to account on something different now. But had a poor go, and he wasn't. The broadcast media largely couldn't, because he's got to be given credit just because he's a Democrat. And anyone else was
same with Nicola Sturgeon here, of course.
Yeah, great example of it.
Yeah, it's just the progressive media just haven't laid a finger on her at all.
And it's not just this. I mean, in her case, the atrocious record on drug deaths in Dundee and Glasgow, it just the worst in Europe, and it's well resourced.
I mean, far be it from me to defend the government and Boris Johnson, but it's been classic, with the whole pandemic thing, how on the left they praise the NHS, but they're very careful not to praise the government.
Yes, yeah.
NHS is great. The NHS has done everything right.
But that was when Johnson. It was really interesting to live through a period where a prime minister nearly died. So when Johnson nearly died and recovered and came out and said that the NHS was about love, at that point, the Labour Party couldn't actually, it was beyond criticism. Actually, for a tiny little window, and then all the usual divisions are mobilised and it starts up again. Yeah. I mean, it has one of the other.
How do you think Boris has handled it?
I don't think the government's handled it particularly well. I don't think any government would have done. And actually, to give him credit, Obama said that. These things are different to the flu viruses they planned for. There's a lot of chaos. I think I would always try and make the point. I tried to make it a lot, which is that most Western states have deindustrialized to the extent they can't make stuff. So it makes you very vulnerable when you need stuff. You're not resilient at all. And I think, the point's been made, whether a government could let itself be in that position again is debatable. A sensible government would try and get some resilience back. But it seems, it was an awful way to do it, but it seemed to prove a lot of the things that we were saying for a long time about real jobs, real manufacturing. The very idea of a nation state needing to be resilient because an uncertain world seems before the pandemic it seemed desperately old-fashioned. Now common sense.
Yeah, no, interesting. I think another aspect, and I think Dominic Cummings is quite keen on this aspect, is the distinction between government and state, and the way. For example, the NHS is a huge bureaucracy in its own right, which I think is almost beyond government governance. Yeah, if you like. It's a behemoth of its own, for better and for worse. I think, and I think, for example, with they had plans for pandemics, didn't they? But these have been prepared years ago. Somewhere within the NHS bureaucracy, or maybe Public Health England, I'm not really quite sure. But I think it's important to draw a distinction between that wasn't the government's fault.
No, you can. It's easy. It's easy for politicians. It's easy for politicians to blame other politicians.
Yeah. And they've made their mistakes. Yeah. And if they didn't make those mistakes, they would make other ones, no doubt. But I think that the state as a power in its own right is quite an important aspect of our politics generally. I mean, I often think of this government, you know, despite having a majority, what is it, of 90 or something?
80 or 90, yeah.
They have this aspect, this appearance of being in government but not in power.
Yeah.
And Boris kind of, if his kind of flippant manner, he kind of encourages that. He's kind of a good time guy. He wants to cheer people up. He's not really interested in changing how the state operates or basically solving problems, I think.
There's a lack of seriousness in Johnson.
Completely.
And actually, is that the public can only take so much, you know, boosterism and it'll be okay and all this stuff. I actually think he's waning. That's a separate sort of debate, but it's certainly waning. Just to get back to the NHS, I think one of the reasons divisions would always have emerged because of the facts that different people had different pandemics. If you're a public sector employee and you haven't, as Van Morrison said, it would have been a brilliant tweet, one of the best tweets in the pandemic, these guys haven't missed a paycheck. Why wouldn't they want a lockdown? To make, you know, if you're a small business, if you're running a small business and your livelihood or everything you've worked for in your life is up and you know is threatened, obviously you'll have a different view. And I don't think, given what we had to do and what was done, I don't think you can. Those divisions would always have come out just because we have different pandemics. It's like people, you know, some people had a lovely lockdown in a nice village with plenty of space, and other people were stuck with, you know, young kids in a flat and couldn't get out. So I just think it was a blissful little birdsong period, but it couldn't have lasted.
It couldn't last, and it wasn't proper reality, I guess.
No. Sooner or later, proper reality asserts itself.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people that are rushing around saying there's a pandemic and there's a conspiracy and it's this and that. And actually, it probably isn't. It's probably the normal human history of just error, mistake and chance.
Completely.
You agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, it's fuck up rather than conspiracy.
Yeah.
And even fuck up is, you know, excuse my language, but is maybe a bit too strong, because like we've been saying, it's like you don't make one set of mistakes, you'll make another in this type of situation. And it's you know, it's largely unforeseen, largely unprepared for, not known. What do you do? You've got to do something in government, and you've got that responsibility.
Yeah. The psychology of conspiracy theories is interesting, because the really hard conspiracy theorist wants to think that there's some entity that is pulling strings and in a way that's more comforting. But I think actually, no, it's actually worse than that. There's no one to save you in a way. I mean, it's obvious the pandemic could have been a lot worse. You know, there are viruses that have death rates that are an order of magnitude greater or worse. And if it happens, you know, you could say it's a conspiracy. Then all of the other bubonic plague was conspiracy or something. And I think some people find it comforting.
Well, I think, funnily enough, strangely enough, with conspiracy theories, I see as a form of rationalism.
Right.
Is that, you know, it's the idea that we should know what the cause of something is and be able to eliminate it and plan and do it all right. Which, you know, as I think you're leaning towards, is through human history is a chimera. It's a, you know, it's a nonsense. It's never been the truth, and I don't think ever will be.
But as I say, I think it's worse than that. I don't think I think governments, human beings, roll along and react. I don't think that, you know, I mean, sure, someone could start something in a malevolent way, but you know, to say that the government are sort of engaging in a conspiracy, I mean, it is setting aside all the arguments on freedom, which are important arguments. And I think, you know,
I think, sorry to interrupt, but especially to talk about the government conspiring, I think is absolutely absurd. I think there are elements in the state apparatus. You know, we know that the civil service, the state apparatus, was very anti-Brexit and has been very much against the Boris Johnson government. And, you know, they're always leaking
They don't want it to succeed. That's
yes,
for sure,
and I think
extent.
that's a real, institutional aspect we have, and there are elements of conspiracy there, but it's not one big sort of single mind. Definitely not.
Yeah, there was
even there, but like I say, in the government, like you said earlier, I think Boris Johnson, he at least says he's a libertarian, and I believe him, because I don't think he really has much of a plan of what to do in politics. He just wants to basically leave stuff alone and kind of be quite happy-go-lucky and cheer people up. And there's a place for that.
He likes big projects.
Yeah.
But I think my criticism of him is similar to many Tories. Is their main impetus is that they should be in power. It's not so much. I don't think he has a great big plan. I don't think he likes large-scale projects. But beyond that, I can't really see any serious attempt. And maybe that was why Cummings got so upset with it. But the conspiracy theory, I think that's an entirely different thing. I think someone once said, do you believe in the moon landings? And someone said, well, what, you believe in the moon? Not the landings, So I don't know. I think it's this government's done as well as it could have done probably. That's the way it is. Yeah.
So what do you think's next? If you were saying earlier about for example, I think maybe it's quite likely that in September it will all be over, at least here.
I say of holidays that they start before they commence and they end before they finish. It's the anticipation of a holiday, and then there's a period of holiday when you say, okay, I'm back now. You mentally go back, and I think we're in this probably. It could be wrong, it could easily be wrong, but I think we're probably, as we're speaking now, and towards the late summer, we may already be there. In terms of herd immunity, we may be. If what the government says is correct, and 92% of adults having antibodies, it may just be that really the link between cases and deaths has been broken. And if that's true, then to have further suppression measures, proper ones, this autumn and winter and going forward, you'd have to witness what I call a shift in risk tolerance. In other words, that what we used to tolerate in flu, we now won't tolerate in COVID. That could happen. That because of the fear, and I think I'm a big. I think mean reversion is very powerful. I think
mean reversion.
Yeah, mean reversion. So things going back to what the average is. So all these office workers stop commuting, and then people talk about hybrid working. But then the office does get back, 20% go back, and then 30% go back, and then the people that are home in their pajamas are missing out, and they're so eventually it goes back. And I think if I was to guess or make a forecast, I think we probably are the first big state to come out of the pandemic stage. It's probably already happening without us really fully, without the penny dropping. I think we're sort of almost
we there. Are. Just from my observation and living, it's slowly happening, isn't it? Just adjusting one step. It's funny that it's not been a moment. It's not been a moment.
No.
What was Johnson calling it?
Yeah.
Freedom Day or something.
Yeah, it's very silly.
I think he had this vision of suddenly, everything would be great again.
No, it's a process.
It's been completely not like that, and I found it funny with some social events. It seems as if we're a bit uneasy with big crowds of people and social events. I'm not sure if this is completely true, but I think it is.
I think so.
Just not being accustomed to these things and having to adjust to.
We have to reacquaint
these
ourselves.
Social situations of we're not just meeting these people that actually we've been meeting all the time over lockdown and that. It's actually people outside our circle.
But it's polarised, isn't it? I think it's a bit like the politics of it. We've tried to get a sensible position on and critique the government when government when we can, when we think it's justified. Get behind the government when we think that's justified as well. But we're sort of trying to get a reasonable view. But it's polarised. As long as I still see young people and old people and whoever walking in the middle of the Northumberland countryside with masks on outdoors, I still think we're in. A tail position of this, you're still in the culture of fear. You're still in the,
But you say culture of fear. I mean, this is on a personal level. I've got some good friends, elderly friends, who haven't had a jab, and
for whatever reason,
and I'm very concerned for them, and I've urged it on them, and they've refused. And the main reason why they haven't is because they're distrustful of the medical profession. I mean, especially the woman of the couple. She's been in and out of hospital for years and has been pumped through all sorts of different medications which have had all sorts of side effects, and they've been prescribed the wrong thing repeatedly through the NHS.
So it's a breakdown of trust.
Their trust has broken down in, weirdly, not the NHS. They're still like Labour voting loyalists and NHS supporters, but they don't trust the medical profession. They don't trust doctors. They don't trust medicine. So
I'm worried about the where we stand now. The people that are very ill, most of the people that are very ill in hospitals aren't vaccinated, and I'm worried that this is not going away. It's endemic in the world. You can't, 8 or 9 billion people. For lots of reasons, the world isn't going to be vaccinated any time soon. That can't happen. So you'll get a pattern where certain reasonably well-organised states, and despite everything that's said, this we've done. Certainly, the vaccine production and rollout's been excellent, and we're lucky. We're very lucky because a lot of people living in a lot of other states don't have that, and I think it'll be years and years and years. But to get back to it, what that means is that if you're unvaccinated and you've never had it, and you're in a vulnerable group, I worry about that because one day you probably will get it because it's everywhere. So that, I don't know, you can't.
I see it in my case, with my friend's case, as an element of tragedy. And it could potentially be serious tragedy. But while being very worried about them, at the same time, about other people who don't get vaccinated, I'm quite prepared to say you do it at your own risk.
Well, you do. Adults will take. I mean, you can't hold people down. No free society could do that, and you've got to respect people's. I mean, I would respect anyone's decision to say no. I'm just going to take a different view on this. But that's like respecting someone's decision to take a view on anything. To practice things in life which some people, and that's a bit risky or whatever, we've all got to make our own minds up. But we shouldn't forget that the thing that appears to be saving this country is vaccination and the take-up of the vaccination. That's still true. And whether you're not going to get vaccinated or not, the benefits that will accrue from a reopen are down to the jab. And we have to accept that, I think, and thank AZ and the other people that put it together. And I suppose that's the optimistic thing we should finish on.
Yeah, good point.
Great. Good to chat, Ben.
Nice.
Cheers. Take care. Thanks.